One thing that your talk just made me think of about culture eating policy for lunch. I think it's a really important point, and it made me think of a story that I think unfolded in the 1960s in the United States and Canada at the same time, where both governments decided that we would switch from the measurement system then in place of inches and feet to a metric system that makes all kinds of sense to make things work much better. And so the Canadians looked at this proposal from the government and said, you know, that makes a lot of sense. And so on an appointed day, all the signs switched over from miles to kilometers and everything worked great, and Canadians went through with it. And then on the appointed day in the United States, the citizens said, screw you, basically. We don't care what the government says, and continued to do things in miles and feet and inches. And so we're still struggling with that culture as well. So I don't know what advice I have for you with that as background, but what I thought I would do today is first talk a little bit more about what we see the blended learning world looking like, just to give a little more context for the educators in the room. And then I'll switch to talking about the implications for policy and what this means. And I'll try to bring in some of that international perspective that you mentioned in the introduction. I'll do my best. So some of this will be redundant, but I'll try to run through that quickly so that we can get to the interesting stuff and get into the conversation sooner rather than later. So that first question, I think you understand what is disruptive innovation from this morning, but I just wanted to provide another visual just to make sure we're on the same page. Interestingly enough, I have slide rules in my document as well, because before computers were invented, this is how we did computation and calculations. We all existed on the outer fringes of this circle, and whenever we had to do computing, we just whipped out our slide rule in our place and we did it. And what I want you to imagine is that innermost circle represents those people who have the most expertise or the most wealth, and that as you go out these outer circles, it represents people with less expertise or less wealth. And so when that first computer was invented, those mainframe machines, it served those people in the inner circle, and those people in the outer ones had no access. And so one of the questions, the reason I wanted to just quickly talk about this, one of the questions this morning was, how does all of this apply to low-income students or people in low-income contexts? And the answer is actually disruptive innovation is a force that makes products and services that can only be consumed by those in the inner circle accessible to people in the outer circles who have less wealth and less expertise over time. That's the process of disruptive innovation. That's what we're talking about here. Now, we've talked about how it relates to education, that online learning has the same traits as every disruptive innovation we've studied. It's growing really, really rapidly as a result, and the opportunity is to use it to create a student-centered education system, and that's the question if we're going to realize it. I want to just go a little bit deeper on the 4 benefits that we think are coming out of this move and the things that we can harness as educators to set up and tee up the questions for policymakers. So the first benefit I want to talk about is personalization. And I just want to go a little bit deeper on what this actually means. Because right now out in the field in academic literature, there's lots of different definitions for what personalization means. People talk about tailoring learning for each student's strengths or their needs or their interests. We hear about enabling student voice and choice in what they learn, flexibility to ensure mastery of the highest standards possible. Personalization encompasses notions of differentiation and individualization. I actually want to think about it a little bit more simply. Everyone knows the power of a tutor, right? If you get a tutoring experience, one-on-one learning, maybe small group, we all know the power of that, right? There's actually been academic studies done that have measured the impact of a tutor. And not surprisingly, they show that if you learn with a tutor, you get way better achievement for every single student that studies. Some studies have shown that it's as high as 2 standard deviations of improvement over the norm with a tutor. Now, the challenge has always been we can't afford a tutor for every single student much as we would like to do so. So the question, I think, is how do we harness this to provide the benefits of tutoring at scale so that everyone can experience it? So we've talked about this already, about why it's so important, so I'm going to skate through the fact that we have different learning needs at different times, and that our system was built for a factory model, not to accommodate that. And that as a result of that, we get Swiss cheese learning in our students. Huge holes in students' learning because we teach in a factory model system that's the opposite of of how people learn. And what educators always say when they talk about the Swiss cheese problem, they said, you know, I could deal with the Swiss cheese problem, but there's one problem. I don't know which students have which holes. And so that's a huge challenge. And so online learning, this is a screenshot actually from the Khan Academy of that story of Jack. Jack is the student in blue that I was describing this morning, that you can show the actual individual paces and pathways that they take. The second thing I want to focus on is data and feedback. In these online environments and blended environments we're creating, the ability to get data and feedback, we don't have to wait till the end of the year for that one test. We don't have to wait for the midterm exam, for every 3-week unit for a test there. We can be getting results and data to inform teachers every single minute almost, if we want to. Now, I just want to make one point about data and feedback, which is that it's not always a good thing. And so if we use data and feedback in our current system where time is fixed and every student's learning is variable, then we actually get data and feedback is actually very demotivating and hurtful to learning. Let me explain why. In the current system, right, we deliver learning experiences for students, and then we test and assess. And then what happens is that students move on to the next grade, subject, body of material, whatever's next. And only afterward do they get the results, right? Now the problem with this is that if you get results in this manner, with no ability to do anything about it, it's not actionable, it doesn't tell you what you do next, it's terribly demotivating. A quick example from my own college experience, I moved recently from California back to the East Coast of the United States, and I was cleaning out my parents' house as I did so. And I came across an English paper that I had written in literature in college, where the professor basically wrote me a note and said, Michael, you understand nothing about tragic irony, and he clearly had no idea what this book was about. This is a terrible paper. You get a B-. So the tragic irony of that is I just kept moving on and I still have no idea what tragic irony is, I think. When instead we use data and assessment in a competency-based system, it's actually very motivating to learning. So we still offer learning experiences to students. We still test and assess because it turns out that testing is actually an important part of, of learning. But now we use those tests and assessments rather than just to move on and give you the results afterwards. We can get real-time feedback that's interactive and that helps inform what you do next, so that it only once you've truly mastered something, you keep learning it, once you've truly mastered something, that's when you move on to the next subject, body, material, or whatever else. This is called competency-based learning. And in it, data and feedback is very motivating to learners because you can do something with that information. It empowers you. It doesn't tell you how dumb you were or something like that. And so an important thing that I came across in my time abroad was that when I used the word competency-based learning, it meant lots of different things to lots of people. So I just wanted to give a definition of what high-quality competency-based learning is from Competency Works. So the first one is sort of obvious. Students advance once they master a concept, so they don't develop those holes in their learning. The second one is that competencies are transferable from subject to subject, okay, in ways that empowers students. The third is that assessment is a meaningful and positive learning experience for students, so it actually empowers them and motivates them. The fourth one is that students ideally receive differentiated attention based on their individual needs out of this. And then the last one is that learning outcomes don't just emphasize raw knowledge, but when we're talking about competencies, and I think you saw this in your presentation, we're talking about the skills and dispositions more broadly to be successful in life. And you can master some of those dispositions around teamwork through a sport. And sometimes you can master them through a group project in an academic class. But the idea is this broad notion of what it means to be competent for the 21st century in this world. Now, the third thing I want to talk about very importantly, because this question came up, was teacher effectiveness. And there's this nasty little thing that comes out there that technology is going to replace teachers, and it just couldn't be further from the truth. But it's also true that the job of teachers is going to change quite a bit. And so the question I would ask is, what's the best use of face-to-face time in this new paradigm, or quite frankly, any paradigm of learning? And it's almost certainly not what we're doing right now of lecture. Instead, it's these things around mentorship, being the facilitator of learning, tutoring. We talked about the evaluator of learning, what it means to evaluate robust projects or works that you've actually done in performance-based assessments, and counseling even, helping people with the whole child experience to solve what's ever plaguing them. These really are the competencies that I think are important for teachers going forward. And so certainly technology can make anyone a better teacher by providing you more insights, but it's really about using technology to actually shift the job of the teacher and create these new environments. And we're seeing all sorts of team teaching paradigms start to crop up in schools across the world that are moving to blended learning environments. They're throwing down the walls between classrooms to create open learning environments where there are maybe 3 or 4 different teachers working with a big group of students, and they say, hey, you know what? I don't like to be the guy that reads the data here. Can you focus on that? Because I really want to be spending individual time with small groups of students working with them. You can start to do all sorts of different mannerisms of collaborating and working together to create learning experiences, which is going to challenge our policies in some significant ways when we assume that it's always one teacher with 25 or 30 students. So the fourth thing, just really briefly, is a lot of people are using this to control costs as well. In other words, to provide that individual experience when we can't afford a tutor for every single child. Now, the question is, will it fulfill its potential? We talked about this a little bit, about how it's improving. The communication vehicles are getting better. The content is getting better. It's increasingly blended learning. This is the technical definition of blended learning. It's the online learning that a student learns where they have some control over the time, place, path, or pace. It occurs, at least in part, at a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home with a teacher. And then the third part that I didn't talk about this morning is that the modalities along each student's learning path have to be connected. And what I mean by that is blended learning is not simply what teachers used to do with me when I got bored, was they would just send me out to a computer out in the hallway and say, go do some Oregon Trail there, that had nothing to do with my actual learning. The connection between online and offline things, people have to be trying to make that. And you can connect it by data, you can connect it by intuition. There's lots of ways you can connect this, but there's got to be an attempt to make it an integrated learning experience. Now, importantly, what that means is that what we're doing right here, right now, is not blended learning. Taking a smart board or an electronic whiteboard and beaming online curriculum is not blended learning. Why? Because we haven't changed the learning model itself. We haven't given students control over that time, place, path, and pace of learning. And what I would tell you is that the learning model is far more important than the technology, not just in education, but in every single place we've ever seen a disruptive innovation. The model in which it's used is far more important. So similarly, this is not just about one-to-one laptops or digital textbooks. Those things can be enablers of blended learning, but just because you have them, you still may be doing the same old thing. So there's lots of different models of blended learning that we see popping up. No one looks quite the same right now out there, and that's a good thing. Let me just tell you, explain this confusing chart up there. Basically, you have the traditional brick and mortar schools in the blue up there, and they meet online learning in the yellow. And they decide to have a baby, and the baby's name is blended learning, okay? So blended learning then has 4 kids, not twins, but 4 kids. They have a rotation model, a flex model, an a la carte model, and an enriched virtual model. And I'll just show you what each of them looks like, because there's lots of variations and people are mixing and matching them up. But what we've come up with this taxonomy from looking at over 100 schools that were doing blended learning to try to figure out if we could give them a language, just so you could quickly communicate, hey, mine's a station rotation, and someone would say, I have a basic idea of what that means. Not that one is better or worse than another. It's pretty clear to me blended learning is not good or bad. It's just a thing. It's how you use it and how you deploy it that makes it good or bad. So, actually, I'm not going to show you the, I forgot, I'm not going to show you the examples here. So the question then, of course, out of all this, given an unbelievable variety of innovation going on, is what are the policy implications themselves? What does this mean for policymakers? And so the first thing that I would say is that we have to move beyond the old metrics by which we judged the old system. This is true in any disruptive innovation. Just think about the mainframe computers and personal computers. If you tried to judge personal computers by what made a mainframe computer good, it would not have made any sense. Because in the mainframe world, bigger was better. More complex was better. But in the personal computer world, smaller, simpler, more affordable was better. And so they totally did not line up. And so the biggest thing, I think, is our current factory model education system is very built upon inputs and processes, regulating how people do work. And we have to move beyond that. So seat time, literally regulating the number of minutes that students sit in seats, has to go away because, folks, we've been measuring the wrong end of the student for over 100 years now, if you think about it. I'll give you a moment. The second thing is standardization. Making sure everyone does something the same way has got to go as well. We saw a school in England this morning that works really well in certain parts of it, but would not work in other communities, as you said yourself, David, this morning. The third thing is student-teacher ratios. These things are going to look different in different places. We see some schools where there are 50 students in one class, but then for certain moments, it's only 2 people with the teacher. And so you talk to the students and you say, oh my God, this must be a tough experience for you. And they say, why? It's the lowest class size that I've ever had in my life. And because the way they're experiencing it is actually far more personal. So geographic boundaries, traditional teacher certifications, and what it means to be a teacher, we've got to open up our minds of what these things can look like. And instead, focus much more on student outcomes. So this is the important part, is that free up and give autonomy to teachers and principals on the ground to figure out the right ways to educate their students. It might be blended learning, it might not be. That's okay. But just figure out the best way to serve them and say, but we're going to be very tight on the student outcomes. We want to make sure that each individual is experiencing growth in their learning. Not just is there a cohort of learners that get to the 5th grade level because of their date of manufacture, but is each individual student growing in their learning? And with technology, we can do that now. The second one is, yes, college and career-ready standards are important, but I think you raised a really important point there, which is that the standards should be fewer, clearer, and higher. We shouldn't have them be the comprehensive thing that every single person learns the exact same thing. Instead, yes, there's a critical piece of knowledge or skills or dispositions that's common to being a citizen in Brazil or any country that every student probably needs to master. But once they've mastered that core, those common core standards, if you will, as we call them in America, there should be lots of freedom to explore different areas and different passions. The third one is that proficiency still matters. We should still worry that students actually get to mastery. The fourth one is closing, in the case of the United States, is closing the achievement gap, but certainly making sure that poor students in Brazil have the opportunities that every child, no matter the income, has is very important. And then the last one is that graduation rates and signs of persistence that employers care about are still part of this. This happens to be the one piece of this that I dislike the most. Because I think it's somewhat arbitrary, and we should really be looking at each individual growth, but I get that in today's system that's still important. One other piece of policy, which is that in order to enable this freedom of how we do things in exchange for the accountability and true outcome, I actually think we don't have real outcome-based moves right now in our education system, and people who complain about the tests that we've implemented in the United States and elsewhere, they're complaining because we've said, here's your outcome-based accountability, but we haven't given them the freedom to innovate either. And so it's the worst of all worlds. But a couple of principles that are important. First, dollars have to follow students down to the learning experience itself, so that the teachers and educators in the program there can actually control what they spend on and actually serve students in the right ways. The second one is we're starting to see in the United States that you can actually fund partially, not all, but partially on actual student outcomes. So reward providers for making lots of growth with students and things like that. Not teacher evaluation, that's different. I'm not a big believer in that as a policy. But the actual programs themselves. The second thing is having a portfolio approach, meaning multiple ways of providing education, because some school architectures will work really well for some students, and some just won't work well for those students. So having different choices is really important. And then the last part is providing adequate infrastructure. So I totally agree with Rod. I think we should not have governments saying we're having one-to-one laptop programs and that's our policy for innovation. But I do think that governments have to think about funding the basic infrastructure underlying the system. So that means providing adequate internet for all schools so that students can have access to these opportunities. I think that assessments is a big piece of this that has to evolve. I think we have to get away from the one-size-fits-all assessment at the end of the year or at the end of high school and go much more to a robust system of on-demand assessments. I think of it as systems of assessments that are both objective and performance-based. And then the third thing I think is we have to move to transparent student-level data, away from these sort of cohort-based ways of accountability, and really being able to follow each student so that all parents and teachers can get a really good view of what each child that they're working with and serving is able to do and not do so that they can really tailor their help for that child. And we don't have any of those systems right now in place, really in the world. But I think these are the sorts of things that we need to start providing to be able to give people the opportunity to move toward this student-centered world and give teachers and principals the license to innovate at scale. So thank you very much again.